Our guest speaker, Dr. Patricia Beaver, is Professor Emerita of Anthropology at Appalachian State University. Dr. Beaver served for many years as director of ASU's Center for Appalachian Studies. Her research is focused both locally and internationally, with particular interests in community through collaborative research. She has published widely, and by the way, you can find some of her articles online if you just Google her name. Her most recent edited work is From Kathmandu to Kilimanjaro, a Mother-Daughter Memoir, published by McFarland in 2020. Since retirement, she serves on the Elk Knob State Park Advisory Committee, the Florence Thomas Art School Board, and the Ashe County Board of Elections. We're so very pleased and honored to have you with us today, Dr. Beaver. And I'm going to turn this over now to her and to our Zoom coordinator.
Mute. Hi, and thank you so much for that very kind invitation on this snowy day. I see people who I know have worked on this book, so it's very exciting. I'm going to do a PowerPoint. So I'm going to try to get the screen up here. Okay, and let's see if this works. Did it work? Are we okay? Sheila? Okay, all right.
We are good.
Good, okay. So in about the year 2000, and by the way, my husband, Bob White, is here, and he will join me in the discussion afterwards, and he could probably answer more Civil War questions than I can. But anyway, in about the year 2000, I was developing a teaching project on the North Fork headwaters of the New River. And to prepare for the course, I visited the Ashe County Library to see what I might find in the way of historical records. Librarian Joe Green put the Wilson manuscript into my hands. I began reading and was captured by the story, but soon exhausted my supply of nickels for the photocopying machine. So eager was I to take it home and devour this story. I finally finished copying it and moved to my car, where I sat for a while, and then finally made it home to finish reading. I will admit that having spent my entire life in the Mountain South, I never took much interest in Civil War battles and troop maneuvers. However, here was a story of life on the home front during the Civil War in my neighborhood. A murder took place a mile from my house, and a revenge murder occurred on up the road. And most interesting to me were the survival strategies of Caroline Wilson to keep her 8 children and other relatives safe, warm, and fed. My friend and colleague, Sandra Ballard, who is editor of Appalachian Journal, understood the significance of this story. And after tracking down family members for permission, she undertook this publication. Leila Weinstein was her assistant, and Minnie Wilson, kin and neighbors, some of you are with us today, provided photographs and knowledge and genealogy. So Caroline Wilson, let me see if this is going to work. Oh, it seems to have frozen. There. Caroline Wilson and Isaac Wilson and their 8 children lived in Ashe County in the northwest corner of North Carolina, 2 miles from the Tennessee line on what is today Oscar Wilson Road. In the early morning hours of June 17th, 1864, Caroline Greer Wilson was widowed. Her husband Isaac was shot in the back as he plowed their corn. In a dramatic turn of fate that day in June, 36-year-old Caroline Wilson assumed responsibility for her 8 children in the midst of a community at war. The North Fork headwaters of the New River, where Caroline and Isaac lived, is bounded to the west by the Appalachian Escarpment. Here, the state line was drawn just where the mountains on the North Carolina side slope up to their highest point before dropping precipitously down into Tennessee. The Wilsons lived close to the state line, where commerce, kinship, and friendship flowed across the border. At the western end of Ashe County, high elevation, at this western end, high elevation, steep slopes, narrow valleys, and distance from markets meant that settlement had been later, farms were smaller, slaves were few, and property values were lower than in the eastern side of the county. The North Fork communities were smaller and less affluent than the central and eastern districts of Ashe County. Most Ashe County unionists came from the North Fork, and it was here that partisan tensions degenerated into violence, quote unquote. And I'm quoting Civil War historian Martin Crawford, a British historian who wrote the book Ashe County Civil War. There were many reasons for this conflict. There were dramatic differences, inequalities in wealth among the citizens that contributed to antagonisms. Isaac Wilson's and Caroline Greer Wilson's extended families had prospered with properties in Watauga and Ashe counties in North Carolina, as well as just across the border in Johnson County, Tennessee. Yet a lot of people became poorer in the 1850s, and more people became landless. Slavery was an important issue. Wealthy slave owners, including some on the North Fork, certainly supported the democratic politics of the plantation aristocracy. Although at least two North Fork slave owners, David Worth and his father-in-law, Stephen Thomas, were counted among the Whig leadership. Slaves in the county were few. There were 391, this is in Ashe County, in 1860, and slaveholders in the county were few. 6.6% of the farmers, a very small percent, but slaveholders owned about 50% of the county's wealth. Local elites dominated both parties and the local markets and the local courts, and included slaveholders on both sides of the partisan issues. People were aligned politically with state politics and culturally with Southern attitudes, especially about race and slavery. Religion may have also coincided with politics. Baptists, and especially primitive Baptists, by and large favored the Democrats, and Methodists inclined towards the Whigs, the party of social and economic improvement. Yet the churches were divided as well. The Wilsons were probably Methodists. Kin ties were very important in party loyalties then as now. Caroline Wilson, wife of Confederate soldier Isaac Wilson, was a strong Democrat and a Confederate, and many of the Wilsons were Democrats and Confederates, but they were divided, with local Wilsons joining both armies. Though a strict Democrat and a Confederate, Caroline had little tolerance for deserters or for those without loyalty to either party. So most of Ashe County, like all of Western North Carolina, opposed secession until Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, and Lincoln's call for volunteers to put down the rebellion. Then local resistance melted away in the din of enthusiasm for secession, for the Confederate cause, and for war. Young Ashe County men were determined to prove their honor and courage as, quote, defenders of home and family against the Yankee invaders. Much of Ashe County's resistance to the Confederate cause and its Union support was located in the North Fork, Caroline's district. By the summer of 1864, the border saw the politics of vengeance. Violence involved kin-based conflicts between the Wilson and Potter families. Participation in the County's Home Guard and broader family rivalries within the North Fork neighborhoods. So, back to Caroline. According to her son William's memoir of the period, let's see, Caroline Wilson, it's been a fitful night on June 16, 1864. She was worried over the danger to her husband Isaac from bushwhackers in the neighborhood. Isaac Wilson, a lieutenant in the Confederate Army, was home on furlough and planned to return to his regiment in the afternoon of June 17th, after plowing the family's corn. Caroline was especially concerned about the possibility of trouble from Andy Potter, Isaac's first cousin's husband, who lived over the nearby state line in Tennessee, and their neighbor, Tom Stout, whose wife, Liz, was Andy Potter's first cousin. You got that? Early in the morning of June 17th, Isaac tended to his chores outside the house, then joined his family for breakfast. He left the house with 3 of his children and headed for the cornfield, where he began to plow, with daughters Frankie and Jane and son John hoeing behind him. Neighborhood women, it was hoped, would join them in the work. Okay, let me see. As would older daughter Emmeline upon completion of her chores. As Isaac and the children had made their way to the cornfield, Caroline sent 3 of the youngest children, probably Martha, Robert, and William, down the lane to the main road to see if they might observe any unusual activity. The younger children came running back to report that several of Tom Stout's family members were on a ridge looking as if they expected something to happen. Hearing this account, Caroline hurried to warn her husband of danger, but before she could reach the field, 3 shots rang out. Then Caroline's sister Polly Jones came racing along on the plow horse with which Isaac had been plowing only moments earlier to report the sad news that Isaac had been shot in the back. Caroline and Polly's father, Jesse Greer, heard the shots. He came from their house there on the Wilson property and directed Polly to go for help to Alfred Sutherland. Though 2 miles away, this was the nearest place she could be sure of assistance. Now, the immediate explanation for the murder of Isaac Wilson was retaliation for the murder near Trade, Tennessee, of Jack Potter, Andy Potter Sr.'s 3rd son, by the conscript officer, Isaac Wilson. So while the murdered Isaac Wilson was not the same Isaac Wilson who killed Jack Potter, they were kin by both blood and marriage, and the murder of another Wilson by a Potter may have seemed appropriate. Meanwhile, Alfred Sutherland sent his son Doc, whose name was John, down the New River to Creston to inform the citizens there, and in the late afternoon, armed men of the Home Guard began to appear. They were joined by Watauga Home Guard and Wilson relatives from Cove Creek over in Watauga County. Several men went to find Tom Stout, while others went in search of the supposed assassins, who were Potters. The first to be shot in retaliation was a man named Silvers Arnold, who was accused of being a lookout for the Potters. Isaac Wilson's funeral was held the next day and attended by many friends and relations from near and far, mostly women and children. Afterwards, a party led by Gil Norris took Tom Stout on horseback by Trade and through Silverstone along the road to Boone. About 4 miles northwest of Boone, they hanged Tom Stout. After he was dead, they covered his body with branches of trees and sent word to his widow, Liz Stout, where he might find the body. So 2 days after Caroline's loss, her nearest neighbor, Liz Potter Stout, was also widowed. Liz Stout was left with responsibility for her 6 children, 3 of whom would serve in the Confederate Army. Though Isaac Wilson was in uniform, neither he nor Thomas Stout died as a result of battle. The two men, closest neighbors in life, were buried a mile apart, perhaps on opposite sides of a local conflict. Tom's role and his wife's role in Isaac's murder was suspected, but never a certainty. But the men had served on the same side of the war. Their widows were left in similar circumstances, certainly responsible for managing their farms and their families. Martin Crawford concludes that, quote, both Wilson and Tom Stout were protagonists in and victim of vengeful, ill-defined conflict whose day-to-day course was difficult to predict and potentially impossible to control. While Potter's and Wilson's may have been at odds, solidarity along family names was a principle, but never a certainty, and many families were truly divided, with examples of brothers taking opposite sides. Will Wilson's memoir cites John Potter among the Wilson family's closest friends. According to Isaac Wilson's youngest son, Will, the series of murders was shocking to neighbors who had no memory of murder. Writing of these events in the 1930s, he argued that disagreements were often settled by fierce fistfights, but murder was looked upon with horror. The pursuit of men avoiding conscription had led to home guard raids across the state line between Confederate Ashe and Watauga counties in North Carolina and Union, Johnson County, Tennessee. The increasing violence motivated some men of the neighborhoods to join the Confederate Army in North Carolina and some to sign up with the federal troops in East Tennessee. In a border neighborhood of a border county in a border state, tensions ran high. Caroline Wilson provided her family during this ensuing period of scarcity by seeing that her fields were tended, putting up food, and otherwise preparing for the winter of 1864. She used the abundant supply of wool from her flock of sheep to make clothes for her family. She enlisted the help of women in the neighborhood to help with carding, as the wood had to be carded, spun, reeled, and finally dyed, while the boys dug the roots of the white walnut, peeled off the bark, which when boiled made a liquid which dyed wool, yarn, and cloth a rich brown color. Caroline Wilson was an expert in weaving who produced wool cloth for clothing. According to Martin Crawford, the North Fork's inner Civil War, the effect of which spilled over into other neighborhoods, was a microcosm of that being waged on the battlefields of Virginia and Georgia, where most of the district's Union and Confederate militia ultimately pursued the sectional struggles. As its best documented, because it's best remembered, incident, the murder of Isaac Wilson, demonstrates, violence in the North Fork became intimately bound up with family rivalries that at the root may have borne little relationship to the political ideas and identities under whose cloak the protagonist masqueraded, end quote. That's a Martin Crawford quote. The Wilson account describes responsibilities assumed by women, as time and again women like Liz Stout were sent to collect the bodies of their male kinsmen who had been hanged or shot near the border. War took husbands, sons, and fathers away from their families and their farms, and the high toll from death and disease left many women, children, and elders to assume responsibility for the domestic economy. Let's see if this is going to move.
You did it with this. You did it with them.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Can you do it? Let's see. Oh, wait. Here's a little sign. There we go. Okay. A soldier who lived downriver, Calvin Jenkins, married to Nancy Sutherland, served in the 58th Regiment, North Carolina Rangers at Cumberland Gap. Writing to his wife in a letter dated September 27, 1862, he advises her, quote, Nancy, if your mare don't suit you and I don't come home this fall, you better try and trade her off for one that is more gentle. I don't know whether I can get a furlough or not. It's a very hard chance. I will come if I can. He sends news of neighbors in service with him and desires news from the family, promising to send money by way of a visiting neighbor. Calvin Jenkins had few complaints and notes that, quote, I am in good health and that his regiment is stationed in a very plentiful place. We get plenty of corn to feed on and bacon, beef, and flour to eat. We have some hard times here, but not as bad as I expected. Yet Calvin Jenkins died of measles and was returned home, where he was buried in the family cemetery. After Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865, signaling the end of 4 years of war, soldiers returned to Ashe County and Johnson County in dribs and drabs, wounded, sick, and weary. But many didn't return, and their families felt the agony of their emotional, physical, and economic loss. Crawford writes that of the 727 Ashe County men who identified from the 1860 census as having served in the Confederate and Union armed forces, 226 or 31% died as a result of wounds received, diseases contracted, in 2 cases, execution by firing squad. 3 out of every 10 Ashe County recruits, almost 40% of them married men, lost their lives in the Civil War. By the end of the 19th century, local villages provided an array of goods and services for the sake of the home and farm community. Let's see, there we go. Sutherland, for example, featured general merchandise stores whose owners sold, wait a minute, let me see, there we go, sold goods bought in from afar and bought local products of farm and forest. There's the Donnelly store. Okay, churches and schools and post offices and other specialized services were located within a reasonable walking distance of even the most remote dwellings. Sutherland featured a law office, a tannery, a cheese factory, a boot and shoe shop, and a doctor's office. Let's see. While some people were traveling to faraway places like Oregon or even Japan, as in the case with William Wilson, catching the train at Shounds, others traveled little but had access to goods and services of the wider society and markets in Ashe, Watauga, and Johnson counties, and ideas of the world beyond the mountains through the elaborate network of trails, roads, and exchanges that carried people, goods, and ideas from village to village. As schools began to open after the Civil War, the older Wilson children moved to Elk Crossroads, which is Todd, to attend school and stay with their grandparents, and then back to Jefferson, and then back to Sutherland. William alternately farmed for his mother, attended school at Sutherland, and taught school. In 1884, he entered the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, graduating in 1889 with an A.B. degree, and in June 1890, he arrived in Japan as a foreign missionary, where he served for the next 42 years. Retiring in 1932 to Durham, North Carolina, with his wife, Mary Amelia McClellan, he wrote memoirs of his time in Japan called Reflections, which he shared with his family. And some of you may have seen this wonderful account. His notebooks of his early childhood in Ashe County were discovered in 1993 by his granddaughter, Frances Bivens Smith Rector, who wisely and generously made them available to scholars. William Wilson's memoir outlines important kin connections by birth and marriage, which form a dense network throughout the North Fork headwaters. Among my neighbors, descendants of William Wilson and his Civil War neighbors. Wilsons, Souths, Martins, Potters, Osborns, Lewises, Donnellys, Barlows, Wallaces, Snyders, and others. Kin relations sustain and influence life and livelihood. In 1976, my husband and I moved to Brushy Fork Road in Ashe County. We purchased our house, which has been modeled and remodeled and torn down and built back up, from a couple in Washington, D.C., who had purchased it from Jackie Farrington, a teacher in Virginia, whose mother, Virginia Lewis, lived down Brushy Fork Road for us and sold us adjoining property. Virginia was a granddaughter of Caroline and Isaac, and she had gone to Oregon and returned. The people who built our house went to Oregon. The murder of Isaac Wilson happened on Oscar Wilson Road, but the community story reaches around the neighborhood to my own house on Brushy Fork Road. Caroline and Isaac's sons, Robert and John, married sisters, Sarah and Becky Wilson. Robert, or Bob, let's see, we got, and Sarah first lived on Wilson Road across the lane from Caroline, who lived to be 89 years old and died in 1911. Bob moved his family to my house on Brushy Fork Road in about 1902. Let's see if we got that. Yep. Purchasing the house on the corner of Baldwin Gap Road and Brushy Fork Road, where I now live. The house was built in the 1880s by Marion Osborne, who sold out and went to Oregon. So, in about 2000, I began taking my students to interview residents of the North Fork Headwaters communities to learn more about the communities in the region's past and to build collaborations between local communities and the university. In preparing for my students' research, I stumbled onto the Wilson memoir. A couple of years into the project, I met Neva Wilson Hash, who at 90 was living in Jefferson, and it turns out was born and grew up in my house. These are her pictures. She shared stories of her life in the neighborhood and of her brothers and cousins who migrated to Oregon and to Idaho, and her one picture of her own trip to visit her brother's family in Oregon. Whoops, it's not here. Anyway, many neighbors went west to herd sheep, to find other work, to seek their fortunes, and many were part of the diaspora which spread across the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But some descendants of Caroline and Isaac stayed and continued to live in the North Fork, along with descendants of their neighbors, whom their son William Wilson describes in his memoir. Now I follow in their steps around the community. This was interviewing Neva. Caroline and, oh, there's Oregon. Sorry, my PowerPoint was doing funny things today. Okay, Caroline and Isaac's son John and his wife Becky lived first with Caroline on the home place. Then they built a two-story house across the lane where they moved in about 1889. There they raised 7 children. Tim and Judith Weinkauf have raised their 3 children in the Wilson home place in Wilson Hollow. Donnelly's store at the end of Oscar Wilson Road is owned by Joe Donnelly, great-grandson of Caroline and Isaac Wilson, and his son Larry. I conclude my presentation by thanking all the people who helped with this publication by providing photos, genealogical information, and other local knowledge. I also recognize that there are different versions of this story. We have produced Will Wilson's version with commentary by Civil War historians John Inscoe and Martin Crawford. However, soon after this was published, I ran into Joe Wilson, the great Joe Wilson from Trade, Tennessee, who is director of the National Council for Traditional Arts and creator of the Crooked Trail, among his many other contributions to American life. Joe told me there was another side to the story, but despite trying to meet up with Joe, I never got the chance to hear his version. I suspect and I hope that some of you in this audience have answers. And now I want to undo, pause share. I want to quit, stop share, there. Okay, and now I would like to very quickly introduce my husband, Bob White, and because he knows a lot about the Civil War, and then invite your comments and questions.
Pat is entirely too kind about my knowing all about the Civil War. Like all sons of the South, we are steeped in this. My own family, my grandfather and his two brothers, all three went to war in 1861, 3 and 4. One was killed, one disappeared. We don't know what happened to him, and one survived and came home. And here I am. I only wanted to comment today that Pat's work has, in many ways, can be considered a companion piece to other works that bring the saga of this great national conflict to life. Although one could make the argument that people like Carl Sandburg, and as a historian, I finally this past year have availed myself of his 6-volume 1938 history of Lincoln, and particularly the last two volumes that have to do with his Civil War approach, thoughts, life, actions, and all that. Sandburg gloriously brings that to life in broad strokes that cover the whole territory, from the politics to the local, but not nearly so dramatically as this work that grew out of this memoir that Pat was very lucky to have. I suggest, if you want to treat yourself, go read our national poet from the 1960s version of Lincoln's life, and use Pat's work as a companion piece to see how this played out on the local level. The two things are both dramatic in their lyricism and the immediacy of the human experience. Sandburg, of course, was a national poet. Spent 25 years putting this together, and in many ways, Pat and I have enjoyed a couple of decades living in a house that was part of this story. Expert on the Civil War, this is a little bit of a stretch, maybe, but certainly interested. We'd love questions.
Comments, questions.
All right. So if you are on the call and you have questions for either Pat or her husband, feel free to unmute, and now's a great time to do that.
I also invite other stories because I know some of you have them, and we are recording, which I think would be a wonderful thing to get some of these other stories about other variants on the Wilson story.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm Greg Reese over in Trade, and I'm related to both parties, both sides of the Wilson Potter feud. And I had an ancestor, Reuben Potter, who was in the 17th Tennessee that went AWOL for a while, and from family tradition was involved in this shooting, perhaps. Let me undo the video. That was understanding that we had, but now I don't know that for sure. He went back and joined the 4th Tennessee after that to get away from the repercussions. But Andy Potter, from my understanding, was shot by the conscription party right down in the midway section of Johnson County between Trade and Mountain City, there where the bar, Annie's Bar, is, right in that area, was where that was supposed to have occurred. I don't have documentation, but just from family history and what I've been able to gather. So for what that's worth. But I have really enjoyed your book. It's Annabeth got me the copy of it, and really enjoy that because I'm related to so many parties to this: the Wallaces, the Reeses, the Greers, the Wilsons, the Potters, obviously. So, but I thank you for being here today. So, for whatever that's worth.
Great, thank you.
A quick question for you. This is Linda Ivers. I'm going to leave my video off because I'm using my iPad. So getting a decent video is a lot. Question: is the William Wilson memoir available, or is it only in the library?
Oh, no, it's available. It's for sale through Appalachian Journal. You can purchase it, Appalachian Journal at ASU. And actually, I do have a couple of copies here at the house if you want to sort of get in touch afterwards, if that would be easier. But yeah.
Okay, great.
And I think Annabeth's posted on the Historical Society webpage. Is that true, Annabeth? A link so that you could go online and purchase it, or you can print a version and or the request and mail it to the Appalachian Journal.
I posted it somewhere. I was so excited about this meeting that I put like many posts on, but I will make sure I post it specifically so people can find it because I love this book. And I just think everybody needs to know what our ancestors lived through. We see Gone with the Wind. We see the part where the Yankee deserter comes in and Scarlett and Melody shoot him and bury him. But you don't think of that happening, that kind of thing happening around here where our ancestors were. And people coming and, these women that were left alone with their kids and having to do all the jobs that their husbands did. It's just unbelievable. I mean, I think Cold Mountain is required watching and this book is required reading. And we need to find out more about that.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I'll be in touch. I'll email you. As I've been doing my genealogy, I'm a Snyder descendant. And when we go back far enough, I think all of us are related that come from the Eastern Tennessee and North Carolina area. One way or another, we're all cousins. But so, yeah, I'll be in touch.
There's a lot of genealogical material that's in there too that we were able to compile with the help of many of the kin who contributed information. That was pretty fun to do. And it's all indexed, which I love indexes that have I generally start at the back and look at the index and then read forward. So and I actually got my hands on it and worked with it, but it's Sandra Ballard and Leila Weinstein are listed as the editors.
My maternal side of the family through my mother are Wilsons from Doe Valley over in Johnson County. And the story that I was told is that there was two brothers in the Wilson family. I think that would have been through Garland and Alexander Wilson. One joined the Confederacy and one joined the Union. And after the war, when they came back home, of course, the one that fought for the Confederacy was not very welcome on the Doe Valley side of the mountain. So he was sent over into the Roans Creek area. And that's why we have Wilson families on both sides of the mountain here in Doe Valley. I can't confirm that story, but that's what had come down through our family. So, it's interesting. I'd like to research and find out how my Wilsons tie in
Yeah.
with the Wilsons that you're talking about right now. I'm sure that's probably, if you go back enough grandpappies, that they're probably related somewhere.
Absolutely. Other stories? I'm sure you've got some stories.
Dale
There.
Wilson, were you about to speak? I was going to tell you, you should share about your grandmother who married into the family.
Who are you talking to, Annabeth?
Dale Wilson.
Yes.
I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Oh, yeah, I sure can. And hello, Dr. Beaver. It's good to see you. And hello there, Bob. Good to see you. Great presentation. Thanks for doing that and keeping this together for all these years. I'll keep my comments short. I'm glad to be here today.
I was going to say thank you for your contribution to this book too. You're cited throughout.
Glad to do it. And very honored to be a part of that. And Annabeth, what was your question?
Was it was it Verda who married a Wilson, and you had a little anecdote about that?
Oh, yeah. Verda was, of course, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson Barlow and Nancy Potter. So there's the flag right there. So then a generation later, Conley married Verda, which the Wilsons came unglued over that he would marry a Potter. But, love conquers all. So there you go.
Right.
Well, as one of the stouts in the group, I'll be interested in seeing your index. When I first heard the name Tom Stout, I took a deep breath because my second great grandfather was George Thomas Stout, and he went by Tom. But since he was born in 1860, I know it wasn't him. So I feel much better now. So I'll be interested in seeing those connections on that side, because we're also related to the Potters. So we have Potters on, the church and the Stout side and the Harmon, all of that. So we're all interconnected. Thank you. It's a great lecture.
By the way, I don't know if anybody knows, but the Thomas Stout is supposed to be buried in the Potter Cemetery that is located in Paradise Valley. The headstones are gone. If you go up in that subdivision and turn to the right, there's a circle, and that's where the cemetery was. The headstones were removed at some point. I'm not going to get into that because it makes me angry, but the headstones were removed so somebody could cut the hay, and the headstones were piled up somewhere, and they're not there anymore. But that's where it is. It still will actually, on some of the old maps, will show there in Paradise Valley where the Tom Stout, my understanding, I'm assuming Tom Stout was buried with the rest of those Potters there. So
I must remark, you need to keep your fingers crossed on those headstones. We had a family headstone that disappeared from the Barren Ridge Cemetery in the Shenandoah Valley where I grew up. Headstone disappeared sometime after World War II, and nobody knew quite what happened to it. There had been a great cleanup of the cemetery, and they thought that all the trash had been taken over to Miss Ruby Wine's woods and dumped. And in fact, she reported it being there in the late 1940s. Well, our family looked for it and looked for it and looked for it, never found it. About 15 years ago, I got a call from a cousin, an antiques dealer near Winchester. The son of an antiques dealer in Winchester was cleaning out his father's antique shop and came across the headstone and had the gumption to get in touch with the record keepers at the Civil War Museum in Richmond, found out where Charles Miller killed on February 3rd in Berryville, Virginia, where he had come from. And they brought the headstone back to the church, and we put it right back in the tomb, in the base where it had been until it broke. Back in the World War II era, there was a tree limb that fell on it, but the headstone came back 75 years later. So keep your fingers crossed.
and you did touch on the Bauer family that lived in Trade, the David E. Bauer. Their cemetery, the family cemetery, he's not buried there, but the earlier descendants were buried on the hill above Trade Elementary School. And the family took those headstones when they left. And of course, David Bauer filed a petition later to try to recover his property there in Tennessee. But those headstones were gone, and I knew a family member that actually had some of the headstones in his garage at one time. And my dad would, when born in the 20s, would plow that ground up there with a mule, and he was always afraid of plowing too deep because he knew that he knew there were graves there. And recently, a construction crew was up there, and they were stopped. And they stopped working because the word was that they had got into the graveyard that nobody supposedly knew about, but everybody knew about. So
Sure.
yeah, there's a lot of history there in those old cemeteries that are gone that unfortunately we'll never recover. But I really appreciate you touching on that story as well in your book. So
yeah, that's a great story. Yeah.
One thing that's very sad is how many men were killed by the home guard or otherwise that we don't know where they're buried. Like my great grandmother was married to a man named George Dotson, who had been hiding, I think, to avoid being conscripted. And he had come back to see their daughter, who was sick. That's the story goes. And he was captured. And they were trying to take him to a prison in Bristol or somewhere, and he and another man tried to escape, and they were shot dead. And my other great grandfather was killed by rebel soldiers or what have you. So much murder went on back then that we just don't know. But they didn't find a lot of those bodies. It was so dangerous for people to come out and try to retrieve them that sadly so many men were just never found.
Right. Exactly.
well, I'll throw this out because everybody asks this every time I do a history presentation, is the story about the jingling hole. Patricia, have you heard anything on that? Personally, I have my own opinion that it didn't exist here, but I'm really curious to see if you've heard anything, because that's pretty close to where you live as well. So
It's right up Barlow. Yeah. I've just heard that story, and I kind of yeah, it's creepy. Yeah. And
Okay, so now you have to share it because there's people on the call that may be here for the first time.
Yeah, so
that
give
don't
it
know
up.
the
Let's hear it.
story. So give it up. You got to tell the story.
Okay, Greg, you got to. I can't. I've got actually. Yeah, I was looking for the book.
well,
That's funny.
somebody posted a story online a few years ago, and I've heard the story from other people that supposedly the Home Guard, which were Confederate sympathizers, would take prisoners, and there was a vertical cave located near where the present-day Maymead Stone Plant is on 421.
Oh,
And supposedly there was a log that went across there, and they would hold on to it and stomp on their feet as their spurs jingled, and eventually they would fall down into the cave. Now that was the story. I've seen a similar story out of, I think it was Buncombe County, North Carolina. Sounds very familiar to me, but it's like I always say, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So I just wonder if you've heard anything about that. Mr. Stout can probably give us something here if he's online with us. I didn't see, but everybody asked me about that story if it's true, and I wondered if you've dug so much into this, if you'd heard that.
somebody brought that story to me. Oh, probably just a couple of years ago, and I had no way of verifying it or. Yep. So I don't know a thing. Does anybody know about that?
But you
I
have
would
the
like to ask if anyone knows why a particular area in trade is called the Bloody Third, and is the jingling hole in any way related to? I mean, there's a story there. I don't know what it is.
Well, the Bloody Third had to do a lot of times with the Potters, and there was a lot of Silvers Arnold that was involved in the story that Patricia came from there. He was related to me through the Reese side, but a lot of those The third was kind of like one of those areas that was a little more rambunctious than the others, and just got that reputation around the turn of the century. And I guess technically the Jingling Hole would be in the Bloody Third. So it's the third district.
That's where my grandfather lived.
Who was your grandfather?
George Dowell.
Okay. Yeah. We're probably related through the Potters.
I bet we are. I'm glad to be related to such a good storyteller.
Right. You know.
Only what you've heard.
Oh,
I've
okay.
only,
Yeah.
we both got the story at the same time, same person.
Right. Oh, I was thinking about with Bloody Third.
Oh, a familial conflict. It's like Pottertown. The reputation is probably, there's a good chance it was exaggerated. There are kernels of truth and real interfamily issues, but the next door neighbor tells the story, and then the person down the road tells the story, and pretty soon you've got a label that you can't escape.
And then the press picks it up.
Right.
Yeah, and so then it's all in the newspapers, and then it becomes even.
Yeah.
You have to deal with myth and legend. So where does it fall?
Right.
Well, it has certain advantages. When we
story.
bought our house here in '76, we would tell folks that we lived on the other side of Pottertown, and they would go, "Oh, how do you manage?" Well, it in fact has been delightful from the day we couldn't have better neighbors, and the reputation served to keep a lot of other folks from coming this way. We've enjoyed from the get-go, but the reputation preceded us.
Now, Annabeth, you had another story, too, a Wilson story, didn't you?
Oh, no, it was just Dale. He and I are related, and he, yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to tell that.
Okay. All right.
I'll interject though about the Jingling Hole. I just think people were so mean. Some people were so mean and evil back then and looked for any excuse to kill people that if there was a hole around, they made a jingling hole out of it. So there may not have been an established certain one, but that's the thing that really earmarks that era, is that it gave mean people an excuse to be, or a license to be even more evil. Connie?
Yes, I'm DAR through John Potter and also Godfrey Daniel Stout, but I'm also a descendant of Levi Guy. And I've read and seen articles about the Wilsons and the guy what were involved with this Guy hanging of Levi and his sons. So I don't know, if it's true or not. So, but it's all in the same area.
I do have a little background on that. The guy, Levi Guy's son, was hung, and Jefferson May's son, well, like 12 or 13-year-old Jacob May, was involved in that. He was hung as well, although the two guys said that he wasn't involved. And,
he wasn't involved?
What's that?
He was not involved?
That he was not. He just happened to be with them when they were caught. But there was a man in the home guard named Shepherd, and he was the one who was supposed to have hung them. And then later, some of the residents of Trade in the area right here caught him over in the Wallace settlement and hung him around Christmas in, I think, 1864 or so, 63 or 64 or so. Joe Wilson relayed a very interesting story to me about that sometime, and I'll get with you on that. So not to monopolize this conversation. I've said too much as it is, but yeah, there's some. He was hung. There were the two guys' sons were involved, but again, like I said, we don't know what all was going on, and sometimes people took the excuse to hang people. So
there's a question from Clinton in the chat. He said, has anyone ever discovered the exact location of Isaac and Caroline's home? does a photograph of it exist? And the and Osborne Wilson descendant thought it was on the same side of the road as the cemetery. Others say it was across the road from it. So any information on that?
No, there's no photographs of it. And see, I don't know if it's, yeah, that's a good question.
Tim and
Does
June
anybody
South.
know? Dale, would you know? Because they're
Oh,
the next generation's house is on the left and the cemetery's on the right as you go. And I think I tried to figure that out at one point just from reading the narrative. But I don't know the exact location.
no, I'll chime in there. It's if you were parked at today's Weinkauf house and you go down Oscar Wilson Road, Argus Wilson, my granddad always said it was on the right side of the road going down the road, about 300 yards below the Weinkauf house. But I know of no photo or any other history. I wish I did.
I know.
So are there any other questions? If not, we're going to turn it back to Annabeth to close out our program for today. But wonderful presentation by Dr. Beaver, and thanks to her husband for his input as well. So Annabeth, would you like to close out the meeting today?
I just want to second the thank youing, because I'm just so excited about getting to hear you in person, Dr. Beaver and Mr. White. Instructions on how to copy the book will be posted. You have to order it from Appalachian State unless you contact Dr. Beaver. She has a couple of copies herself. We'll post that on the Johnson County Historical Society Facebook group page. And we'd like to invite you to join us there for more history and events that take place in our county. We appreciate very much our guests that were able to join us today. And
Yes.
we're going to adjourn here in a minute and then go to our regularly scheduled business meeting of the Historical Society. Anybody that would like to join us, you're very welcome. We would love to invite anybody who would like to be a part of the Historical Society. We meet over in Johnson County. Unfortunately, we've had to meet a lot on Zoom, but we invite anyone. And once again, thank you very much.